So, so your discussion board on fog of war is due tonight. So you should all be working on that. And today we're going to talk about the organizational structure, which is chapter 15. And basically, the message is that organization structure is changing. America is emerging as a gig economy. That means that organization structure has become more flexible. Companies have gotten away from the traditional bureaucratic form of organization that we'll talk about. And that's an important word, bureaucracy. It was coined by Max Weber. Okay, let's take care of that. 2, 3. The idea is that bureaucracy means that there are assigned offices associated with job requirements. So hiring by merit, chain of command. So people are given authority and responsibility based on their skill as measured by the organization. And hiring is not for paternalistic reasons. And bureaucracy was, I said one of my classes on Sunday that it was invented by the Chinese, and somebody raised their hand and said, no, it was the Egyptians. And that could well be. The Chinese were famous for establishing a version of bureaucracy that used civil service examinations, which has largely been adopted in the West. It worked for 2,000 years, but it's got some rigidities to it, which means that American companies have used it, but have also gotten away from it over time. And a more flexible approach is the gig economy, which means that people are hired ad hoc. So according to your book, 35% of the workforce in America, 57 million, did some freelance work in 19, and the number is growing. I work full-time, but I've at various points done freelance work. So even I have done this. And basically, the reason if the gig economy is growing is that organizations are in large part communication mechanisms, that the reason they exist is that they facilitate trust and communication. And if there's easier ways to communicate, then some of the reasons for organizations will fall away, and people will use other methods. To see why organizations are communication tools, you can look at the army. The Roman army, going back 2,000 years, is a good example. I'm sure there are other methods, and I'd be interested. I haven't looked at how Chinggis Khan organized the Mongolian army that was so successful. They conquered about a quarter of the world, well into Eastern Europe, India, all over the place, China. And I, I, I haven't looked at what kind of organization structure they use. I've read a couple of books, but I don't think they understand it that clearly. But I'd be interested in finding out, because my guess is it was somewhat hierarchical, but also there was probably a great deal of flexibility and empowerment, and this facilitated their invasions. But in any case, to see why organization structure is a communication tool, if you think about the Roman army, well, let me clear all this. If you think about the Roman army, there was a head, and then 10 people reported to the head, and then 10 people reported to those 10. It's hard to draw these, so I won't do all 10, but you get the idea. And so if you have a system based on tens, you can have 4 levels, and the head, the capo, can reach 10,000 people. 10 times 10 times 10 times 10, 10 to the 4th. That's 10,000 people. And that works really well to reach a lot of people fast if you don't have cell phones or email, which of course they didn't have 2,000 years ago. So when companies started to form under free market capitalism, which would have been the earliest, were like in the 16th century and the late 1500s, but you had the commercial revolution, but you didn't really have much industrialization. There was a long period of industrializing, and the governments didn't really reduce the amount of regulation that much. A lot of these things happened because the governments weren't functioning well, not because they allowed it. And by the time that there was some significant industrialization in the early 19th century, you started to have the formation of big companies. A lot of this was due to the expansion of markets and improvements in transportation that occurred because of canals and so on. But as these organizations formed, they were often badly run, and you could call them paternalistic. And the kind of organization that existed in the 19th century might be characterized by the shape-up system. The shape-up system is where a supervisor stands at the gate of the plant and decides who gets hired for the day. And often the employees would bribe the supervisor. And this kind of chaotic organization was inefficient. The first really large-scale organizations in America were the railroads, and they had to grapple with forming more efficient organizations. Naturally, an important model was the Chinese civil service, which I think many firms adapted. Americans were well aware of Chinese business practices going back into the 18th century. China at that time was the wealthiest country, and the only reason they stopped being the wealthiest was uh, resistance to industrialization. And that's kind of an illustration of how culture, organizational culture, if you will, in this case, national culture, can resist change, which in turn slows down progress. But in any case, companies tended to adopt the bureaucratic structure by the late 19th century, and it worked to a degree, but by the 1940s, the sociologist Robert Merton wrote an article where he recognized that bureaucracy tends to become an end to itself, and it's often inefficient because first of all, there's conflict between departments, and also because bureaucracy creates ritualization, that the rules become an end to themselves. And employees, my wife recently immigrated here. She was applying for a driver's license, and we go to the DMV, and she wanted proof that we live at a given address, and I give her an envelope, and she says, "Oh no, this has a post office box." So I say, "Well, we don't get mail delivered to our home because we don't have we're in the rural setting. We don't have a mailbox. We get it sent to a." "Oh no, it's not acceptable. It has to be sent to your address." So the rule becomes an end in itself. The common sense gets thrown by the boards. And so this is characteristic of bureaucracy. And so part of the reason I think that alternative structures have become more widespread is that, first of all, the communication issue. There are alternative methods of communication. Second of all, bureaucracy is often inflexible and it can resist change, and also sometimes results in interdepartmental conflict. Like the economics department doesn't like the business department. That goes back 30 years here. So, there's that. So basically, alternative methods began to become more widespread over time. But the basic kind of organization structure that firms adopted in the 19th century, say the railroads, would have been called the functional form of organization. And the functional form of organization, the idea of the functional form of organization is that the departments are set up by function, by which I mean things like marketing, finance, HR, and so on, manufacturing, or what have you. So each department reports to the CEO, and it's based on function. That's the functional form of organization. In an alternative form, I hate to erase this because it's hard to draw those things, but I don't know how to erase them individually. So in the divisional form of organization, the CEO has reports, but it could be based on product, or it could be based on geographic location, or it could be based on nature of customers. But there's divisions, and each division has its own staff. So it has its own set of functions. So you would have, in each division, you would then have the marketing, you would have the finance, you would have the HR, etc. Okay, so basically in the divisional form, there's a lot of duplication. Each division has its own marketing director. All right, so why do they do it? Well, the reason they do it is that it's more efficient because each division understands a different market. There are different informational requirements. It could be as simple that, let's say, the first place I worked, International Nickel, basically had a functional form of organization, but they did divisionalize by location. And the reason is obvious. There's a mining company, and they own mines in South America, Indonesia, and a lot in Canada. And basically, it's very difficult to manage a mine in Latin America if you live in Canada. You have to be on the spot. So there's a different reporting hierarchy by location for obvious reasons. It's much harder to manage from far away. So that problem is easily solved. But let's say you're General Motors, and this goes back to the book by Alfred Chandler, Strategy and Structure. And Chandler in that book said that the divisional form by the 1950s had become the standard form for the large American corporation. And the reason it had become the standard form was that the companies had grown by accretion, by acquisition, corporate acquisition. And a lot of companies had diverse divisions. And so in order to manage them, you needed decentralized management in order to handle the diverse problems that confronted the different divisions. So in his book, he came up with the phrase structure follows strategy, which is the idea that the strategy could have been somewhat spontaneous, and to call it a strategy may not be fair. This isn't a course on strategy, it's a separate course. But a guy named Carl Weick argued that strategy follows structure, the exact reverse, because the structure creates the experiences that create the strategy. But regardless how you look at it, what happened with GM is that a guy named William Durant was a great entrepreneur, but a terrible manager. And he bought a lot of car companies, Oldsmobile, et cetera. And he assembled this big collection of car companies at a time when the automobile was first being innovated. And basically, what he did was mismanage the firm. So, in other words, Durant was great at entrepreneurship and buying companies and making deals, but he was terrible at actually running the companies. So the company went bankrupt, and he lost control. And then he went out and he founded Chevrolet, and he bought back General Motors with the stock of Chevrolet. And he took it over again, and then he bankrupted a second time. And by then, the biggest shareholder was the DuPont family. The DuPont family owned a company that still exists, and I think they still own a large chunk of it, or successor companies called DuPont Chemical, based in Delaware. And it's been merged and unmerged, and I don't know what the status of it is, but they go back a couple of hundred years, and they still have a lot of influence. And basically, they asked one of their own, Pierre DuPont, to run General Motors, and he had been the CEO of the DuPont Corporation, the chemical company, and he then was thinking of ways to restructure GM, and he noticed a entrepreneur who had sold his ball bearing company to General Motors and was then an executive at General Motors named Alfred Sloan. And Sloan came up with the idea that you set up different divisions based on price, based on market segment. So you have Chevrolet, Pontiac. Oh, misspelled Pontiac. Sorry about that. I'll just leave it. Oldsmobile, Buick, and lastly, Cadillac, most expensive. This is in order of price. And you set up separate divisions, separate managements in each division. And the reason is that the managements better understand the market segments. The problem that Sloan was facing was that he had to compete with the dominant car company in the early 1920s and teens, which GM overcame by the end of the 1920s, Ford. And Henry Ford had created a car called the Model T, which was low cost and bad quality. It had low quality, low cost. It was extremely cheap, and almost anyone could afford one. In today's dollars, they would run maybe $4,000, something in that area. And Ford's theory was that most of the people who would buy cars were farmers who knew how to fix cars. So the cars didn't have to work that well because the people who ran cars knew mechanical things, and so they could fix the cars. And that wasn't what happened. So his theory didn't work out, and most of the Fords were being sold in cities. And so Chandler got the idea that what GM would do was that in each market segment, they would compete at the high end of the segment. And then when the people who bought the new GM cars got tired of them after a few years, they could sell them and create a used car market. So he created that idea. And the used Chevrolets would then compete with the Model Ts. So basically, he, in one swoop, he created this organizational structure, but it was in the context of the markets of that era. And so the idea is that the organizational structure should match the environmental reality. And to the extent that it does, the company is going to succeed. This idea was discussed by these two organization theorists named Lawrence and Lorsch, who taught at Harvard. I knew Lawrence's daughter. She was a professor at San Jose State. Lawrence and Lorsch were before my time, though. And basically, Lawrence and Lorsch argued that you need to have the appropriate divisionalization or differentiation in organization. So a company like General Motors that fit their markets is going to succeed. But you also need the appropriate integration. So companies that differentiate or divisionalize to the appropriate degree and break their companies up into divisions have to also, in turn, reintegrate those companies. You can think of it a lot like the US. The United States was based on a divisional form, the states. So you had the states, and there was too much conflict under the Articles of Confederation. If you know your history, the Articles of Confederation preceded the Constitution. And because there was too much conflict between the states, there was an interest in strengthening the Articles of Confederation. And without going into the history too deeply, Hamilton and Madison argued that you need a stronger central government to integrate the different states or the different divisions. And so they argued that a more appropriate kind of integration required a stronger central authority. And thus you had the birth of the federal government. So basically, this idea of differentiation and integration can be seen in where I used to work, Johnson and Johnson. You've probably heard about them recently with the vaccine, but the vaccine was not invented by Johnson and Johnson Corporation as a unit. It was invented by a division of J&J, Janssen Pharmaceutica, which was a Swiss, or is, I should say, a Swiss firm that was founded by a guy named Janssen that J&J bought. And I don't know who runs it now, but for many, many years, Janssen and then his son ran it. And they were very, very creative researchers. And they invented a lot of drugs. And J&J made a lot of money off this division. So basically, J&J had, when I worked there, 70. Now I think it's closer to 150 divisions that had absolutely nothing to do with each other. They were like a drug company. Ethicon made birth control pills. You had a baby powder company, which got into trouble recently because it causes cancer, and they're getting sued. You have Tylenol. You have health technology, all kinds of different divisions that have very, very little to do with each other. They're all independent, and they're run as independent companies. So each division has a marketing department. Each division has an HR department. Each division has a finance department. Now, you might say, how do they work together, or do they work together? Is this just like an investment? Like Berkshire Hathaway, you could say, is really just a holding company, Warren Buffett's company, and the companies have nothing to do with each other. He owns Say's Candies. He owns one of the railroads. I think it's Union Pacific, or not Union Pacific, one of the railroads. I forget which one. And on and on. And he owns all diverse, all kinds of crazy companies that have nothing to do with each other. And he doesn't really care, because all he's doing is holding them and letting them manage themselves, and they have nothing to do with each other. Now, for him, that's appropriate, because all he is an investment manager. He's not operating manager. But what that does is it limits the economies of scale that can be attained. For instance, Say's Candies can't have the same benefit program, or if Say's Candies goes out for financing, maybe they can go to Buffett and ask for money, but they're going to be treated in the open market as a separate entity from the railroad, or from Geico, which insurance company, which Buffett also owns, and so on. So these companies all have separate operations, and there's not going to be a confluence of, if, for example, if the company needs financing in multiple companies, J&J can go out and ask for the financing as a unit and get a better rate than the smaller division would get on its own. And so what Lawrence and Lorsch argued is that the appropriate degree of integration, of differentiation, has to be coupled with the appropriate degree of integration. And the way that they integrated the companies, not that they integrated, but that they saw the companies as being integrated, is through control, through supervisory control, which Buffett does exercise, but it was also through things like corporate culture, uh, rotating employees around the company, having meetings annually of all the functions so that, for example, at J&J, once a year they would have, or multiple times a year, they would have a meeting of all the finance directors or a meeting of all the HR directors. So the heads of the divisions from all over the world would meet in New Brunswick and discuss different problems. And so they would all meet each other, they would all exchange ideas, they'll get to know each other, and then people get rotated around the divisions. And so they learn about the different divisions. And so basically the culture and the job rotation and the control all work together to reintegrate a company. So for example, one of the things that Sloan recognized was that there are certain functions that do benefit from economies of scale. Not all things do benefit from economies of scale. Ronald Coase recognized this in the 1930s. And he wrote about the economics of organizations. Why do organizations reach certain sizes? And he concluded that the costs and benefits of scale, of size, are going to drive that. Some organizations do better very small, some organizations do better very large. And the optimal size is going to vary for different reasons, including the skill of the entrepreneur. And so basically, to integrate these different divisions, you might use things like corporate benefits. So there are certain functions that Sloan realized do benefit from economies of scale, I was saying. And so basically those you want to parcel out. And the example he gave was of the research and development function. He believed, I'm not sure this is true, but he believed that all cars will benefit from a centralized research and development function that does research into automobiles and then comes up with new ideas. I mean, this may not be true. In fact, I don't think it is, because if you look at who really innovated in cars recently, it was a startup, Elon Musk, and not General Motors and not any of the other car companies. So basically, it may not be true that a centralized R&D, but he believed that. So he's parceled out the R&D function to the corporate office. At J&J, in order to tie all the organizations together, everybody had the same benefit plan. So if you work for Janssen Pharmaceutica, or you work for Ethicon, or you work for Johnson & Johnson Products, or any of the other, you work for McNeil Labs, any of the companies, you would be in the same Johnson & Johnson benefits program. And that kind of tied you together. So the benefits people were in the corporate office. So that was my function there. So I worked in the corporate office. But there, a lot of this stuff had nothing to do with the corporate office, and it was decided by the marketing executives in those divisions. So basically, getting into some of the details of organization structure, it's the way that jobs are formally divided, grouped, and coordinated. And so there are certain key organizational design questions. First of all, how you subdivide the work, how you cause labor to be specialized. The idea of the specialization of labor goes back to Adam Smith, the great British economist of the late 18th century, really mid to late 18th century, who wrote the book, The Wealth of Nations, which is arguably, I would say, likely the greatest economic book ever written. And basically, he says in there, he talks about a famous example. It's a lengthy paragraph, so I won't read it, but he talks about pin makers. And he points out that a single person trying to make a pin, even if they're a skilled craftsperson, would take at least a day to make a single pin. But if you parcel out the responsibilities and divide the labor into multiple divisions, you can make dozens or thousands of pins a day. And, as time went on and machinery improved, today you could probably make tens of thousands of pins in a given day, given the division of labor and the improvements in technology. So the idea of division of labor is very, very important. And labor is specialized, and this greatly increases efficiency. So in society, you have it too. One person's a doctor, one person's a dentist, and one person's a lawyer. And this means that they're able to be more productive than otherwise. However, it's also true that there are diseconomies to the extent of specialization, just as there are diseconomies to the size of organization. And it's not always clear. Americans like specialization because of the history of scientific management and the effect of Taylorism on our society. I talked about Taylor earlier in the semester. However, in other countries, departments are less specialized, and it's not clear that they're necessarily less efficient as a result. So any of these things requires balance. Also, other issues in organization design besides subdivision of work include grouping of jobs or departmentalization, reporting relationships, the chain of command, how many reports per manager or the span of control, where the decision-making authority rests, which is centralization and decentralization, which I was just talking about with the idea of the divisional form of organization, the scope of rules and how formalized rules are, which is formalization, and the interaction of individuals from different structures, which is boundary spanning. And basically, departmentalization, as already said, can be functional or federal or divisional. Federal is the same meaning as divisional, as in the federal government. And these would include the products or services, divisionalization. So I already talked about General Motors being divisionalized by product, Johnson & Johnson being divisionalized by product. Firms can also be divisionalized by geography, which is how the United States is divisionalized by the geographic location of the states. And different companies, you might have the East Coast division or the West Coast division, things like that. You can have process divisionalization. So things that are made by one process or in one division, things that are made by another process or in another division. Or you could also divisionalize by the nature of the customers. One division focuses on corporate customers, another division focuses on academic customers. So you can have divisionalization by customer, by process, by geographic location, or by product. You have also the chain of command in any organization. The idea of unity of command is increasingly violated, but it's usually advisable that a person should have only one supervisor, that if you have multiple supervisors, there will be conflicts. Now, the chain of command, the rigid reporting relationships characteristic of bureaucracy, is increasingly considered old-fashioned. And some alternatives are like the STAR organization, which you might call the circle, where different people report to one central point. And another approach would be the all channels network, where nobody reports to anybody, everybody's equal, it's collegial. Universities are kind of organized that way. The trend is away from chain of command and towards the gig economy, towards greater flexibility. And as I say, the reason for this includes advancement in technology, the invention of cell phones, the elimination of organizations as communication devices and their replacement with technology. Another reason is that the bureaucratic form of organization, as I mentioned, tends to lead to too much rigidity. And so what you had in the 1950s kind of organizations, a lot of levels, and the levels would often become ends in themselves, and there'd be a lot of political infighting and things like that. And so over time, firms have downloaded responsibility. And this was the message of Hertzberg in his two-factor theory, that you make jobs more challenging and more interesting by reducing the number of levels and vertically downloading responsibility to the rank and file employee. And firms did this. I don't think it was chiefly as a motivational tool. I think the main motivation was globalization and the need to become more cost efficient. And so having fewer levels meant making the work more challenging for the lower level people. So I've talked a little bit about departmentalization, chain of command, span of control. Wider span of control means fewer levels. Fewer levels is more modern. If you have more reports, it's more difficult to oversee the work of each report, but if the employees are highly skilled or independent contractors, then you don't need narrow span of control. So the trend has been away from narrow spans of control towards broad spans of control. And the trend has been away from centralization, or the degree to which organizations are centralized. And that would mean the more functional kind of organization, to more decentralized organizations, more divisionalized organizations that can act more quickly to solve problems. Employees are less likely to feel alienated in decentralized organizations, and their knowledge is more likely to be fully utilized. And you could say the same thing with the states. I think part of the reason the United States was successful and was the only, it's really today the only country with over 100 million people in the top 20 in terms of wealth per capita. And I think a lot of the reason is the decentralized federalism that enabled the states to tailor their policies to subunits and give expression to greater numbers of people. In decentralized organizations, employees can be more creative, can express themselves more easily, can act more quickly to solve problems, are less likely to feel alienated, feel more involvement. But of course, there's less coordination. So if you want to get things done quickly, if you're fighting a war, you need to have a centralized state doing that. But if you want to implement some kind of welfare policy, or you want to implement some kind of government program, I think the states work better. My conclusion is that the centralized federal programs like Social Security would have probably been better off being run by the states. I think it was a mistake to do it that way. That's my honest opinion. But I won't get into that. I'm not talking about that issue, but I'm just saying, if you're going to have Social Security, I think you would be better off having it offered by smaller units. I'm not saying by micro units. I'm saying by, 10 million or 5 million or 2 million. That's more than sufficient. Okay, so formalization, Fayot. Last time I mispronounced his name last class, but I looked it up. Fayot was a French executive who wrote a book called Administration, and he wrote it in the early 20th century. And in that book, he talks about, it's called Fayot's Bridge. He talks about a bridge that, let's say you have two chains of command in an organization, that normally there's communication across departments that's not reflected in the organizational chart. And this kind of informal communication is incredibly important. So you could say that a lot of the communication that occurs in organizations is not according to the formal organization. You all know this if you work in the real world. So basically, less formalization means that people exchange ideas. The lesser the formalization in an organization, the more flexible the reporting relationships, the freer employees are to experiment. More formalization means less discretion. Now, sometimes you want that. For instance, if you run a bank, you don't want to give the tellers too much discretion. They can't make up their own rules. They have to follow the rules. So, in other words, a tight degree of supervision is probably appropriate. However, if you're running a tech firm like Google, your whole business is innovation. And so you want less formalization because you want your employees to be creative and come up with ideas and exchange ideas. So the tight span of control and tight chain of command that would be appropriate in a bank would not be appropriate in a company like Google. So if you ran a bank like Google, it wouldn't be successful. But if you ran Google like a bank, it also wouldn't be successful. So you need a mixture of all of the above. Now, I talked about bureaucracy, and you can, the different organizational structures, whether it's functional or divisional, can fit into the definition of bureaucracy. As I said, a bureaucracy is just an organization with routine tasks, specialization, formalized rules, functional departments, centralized authority, narrow spans of control, and decision-making that follows the chain of command. The most important aspects of bureaucracy that Weber recognized when he wrote Economy and Society are that the hiring is by merit and personnel policies are objective. So there are rules. And early on, by the 1940s, so it wasn't that long between, say, the late 19th century when the railroads started to recognize that you need this kind of organizational structure, and the 1940s, say 60 or 70 years later, Robert Merton, the sociologist, wrote an article about how in the Americans, I think it was the American Sociologist, I forget which journal, but that bureaucracy leads to ritualization and the rules become an end to itself, that the bureaucracy becomes fetishized by the bureaucrats. One example I just experienced recently was my wife went for a driver's license. She recently immigrated here from Germany, and we went for a driver's license at the DMV upstate, and you needed proof that you resided at your address. And I brought some envelopes, some utility bills, and other things that proved where we live. But we don't get mail at our home. We get it at a post office box. But there was mail addressed to her to the post office box, and the person in the DMV said, "Oh no, this is no good. You can't have a post office, but we don't get mail at the home." So in other words, this kind of obsession with precise interpretation of the rules becomes an objective in itself, and it then becomes dysfunctional. So basically, that's part of the reason why firms have gotten away from the traditional bureaucratic chain of command. And one way around it is called the matrix organization. And in the matrix organization, these things have been around forever. Universities are largely based on matrix organizations. So basically, in a matrix organization, you might have both functional. So you have, the marketing department, finance, HR, manufacturing, whatever. And the employees report to the functions, but you also have product organization. Uh, and so there'll be like a team leader for each product. So, so you could have, let's say you're in a tech company and you have three programs. You have program, if you're SaaS, the the statistical software developer, SaaS Institute. You might have, you might report to a marketing director, but you also report to the team leader of base SaaS or the team leader of market research program, or the team leader of finance analysis program. And so you report both to the marketing head and the product leader. And so you have two reports. And what that does is it helps employees focus on the products that they're supposed to be focused on, but also that if they have problems with their marketing activities or their finance activities or whatever, they can report to the functional head. So in a matrix organization, there's a dual line of authority, which combines both functional and product departmentalization. Now, the trend, as I say, is away from formal organization structure for gig relationships. So in other words, hiring contractors around a small core organization. And this might be called the virtual organizational structure, whereby a small core organization outsources its major functions. This was pioneered in a way by the Japanese, who, like, if you look at the Japanese car companies in the 1970s on, they did an attempt to have the parts makers part of their company. So in other words, they outsourced the parts manufacturing. And what they would do is assign a single firm to be the manufacturer of the chassis or whatever part they were manufacturing. So they'd have multiple firms that contracted with them, and they would be the only client of this outsourcing firm. So the outsourcing firms would be manufacturing given parts. And the reason to do that was an insight by Deming, that W. Edwards Deming, that firms that rely on a single supplier will have more consistent components, and the result is that the components will be understood better and will fit together better because they're consistent. So in other words, you could go to two suppliers and go to the lower cost. This is what government does, but government is inherently inefficient. And basically, if you go to the low-cost supplier, this eliminates corruption, which is the aim of the low bid system. But what that does is it means that you never know exactly how the part will be made. Now, of course, two parts can be according to specs, but be slightly different. And so each manufacturer will have slightly different components, and these don't fit together that well. So what the Japanese car manufacturers realized is if they go to a single supplier, the parts are more uniform. So what they do is they outsource, they decentralize, but they control the manufacturer. And so a lot of the strategic choices that would normally be done by a firm are decided by Toyota. And they tell the firm, if you don't like doing this, you don't have to deal with us. Walmart did something similar. In other words, they copied a lot of this stuff. So when Walmart grew, what they would do is contract with different manufacturers, like say Vlasic pickles, to sell to their stores. But they would tell them the size of the pickles, and they would get to know the price structure, the cost structure of the manufacturer, and they would tell them how big a jar and how much to produce. And so what that did was enable them to charge the lowest possible price to their customer. Now, the pickle manufacturer might say, well, wait a second, we have the right to decide on our profit margin, but Walmart would say, of course you do, but we have the right to decide what pickle manufacturer to deal with. And so it was up to the firm to decide whether to deal with Walmart or not. And the reason a lot of them did was the huge market volume. So they earn a small margin on each unit, but they sell a huge number of units, and so they make more money. So basically, the trend has been in the direction of these kinds of virtual structures. My computer's acting up. So basically, in a virtual organizational structure, small external, a small core organization outsources its major functions to other organizations, just like I said the Japanese car makers did. And this idea goes back to Hollywood. I mean, back in the 1930s and 40s, there was the studio system where the studios functioned like rigid corporations. The producers would be employees of the studio, and the actors would be employees of the studio, and they'd work full time for the studio. And they found that this was not cost effective, but rather what works is that everybody's freelance. And when somebody has a movie, they'll set up a separate production company for that movie and market it to the studio. And so each movie is done as like a gig kind of deal. And again, there was nothing new about that either. I mean, you could say it ties back to the idea of franchising, which which Benjamin Franklin invented in the 18th century. And the idea of franchising is that you decentralize, you outsource a function. So the car companies in the 1930s decentralized. This was again Alfred Sloan, decentralized the sales function and they said, we're going to franchise the sale function. We'll sell our cars to the dealers who will then resell. That way we don't have to deal with inventory, and that'll be the problem of the franchisee. In hollow forms of organization, all the non-critical functions are outsourced. In the hollow form, only non-critical functions are outsourced. In the modular form, key product components are also outsourced. You also have circular organizations that re-image the traditional hierarchical pyramid, but outsource everything that in turn reports to the CEO of the circular organization. The trend since the 1980s has been downsizing and leaner corporations, smaller, leaner. The idea that bigger size is more efficient, it's still believed by a lot of politicians, but anyone who actually has to pay the cost of their bad decisions has realized that it's easy to be too big. And so downsizing has been the pattern since the 1980s. A systematic effort to make an organization leaner by closing locations, reducing staff, and selling off business units is downsizing. That's the definition. And it often involves reducing the number of layers, reducing bureaucracy. And this is the direction in which the companies have gone since the 1980s. As well, it's also true that the trend has been away from mechanistic models of organization, meaning a mechanistic model of organization is a structure characterized by extensive departmentalization, high degrees of formalization, a lot of bureaucracy, in other words, limited information networks and centralization. And that kind of mechanical, hierarchical organization has been increasingly replaced by what you might call organic models, structures that are flat, use cross-hierarchical and cross-functional teams, have little formalization, have more like an all channels communication network of comprehensive information sharing, less emphasis on formal organization, and more participative decision making. And I think that goes along with smaller core organizations. You don't need big organizations because you can outsource a lot. You don't need to own the supplier. The supplier can function separately. If you need to, you could influence the way they manage things, but very often you don't need to. All you need to do is just get a I mean, if you look at how Bill Gates functioned, he didn't really invent anything himself. He just took components that were already in the environment and put them together. The biggest example was well, there were two. One was the invention of the disk operating system, which was his first major operating system, which made Microsoft the dominant software company. And he bought it from someone. He didn't write it himself. He bought it and then reformed it. And then the other example, of course, was Windows, which he basically copied from Apple. And so, you know, Microsoft has never really been an originator of anything to, you know, even now to innovate AI, they invested in ChatGPT, which is run by somebody else. And they've never really innovated anything, but rather invest and put pieces together. And this is really how companies increasingly function over time. Now, going back to Alfred Chandler, who argued that structure follows strategy, you can say that innovation is appropriate to, when you have a firm that's innovative, the appropriate structure would be an organic one. So firms like Google, Microsoft, firms that engage in technological innovation probably are best off with loose structures, low specialization, low formalization, and decentralization. So you want to have organizations that are flexible, where everybody communicates, where people do a lot of things, where people come up with ideas. And if you look at the innovation process is never predictable. You know, my wife has been talking about working on intuitive intelligence. And if you read about how that works, how business intuition works, it's through unpredictable results from combination. So I'm not saying you don't have a goal. You know, I suggest that you have a goal, but that the goal will lead to things, and then your creativity reprocesses it and creates a new goal. So you try to reach a goal, but as you reach it, you restructure the goal. But if you don't have a goal, you don't have a focus. So you need to have a focus. I mean, Bill Gates didn't say, I'm going to make money in anything. He said, I'm going to make money in software. I'm going to divide. And he had a goal, but then he restructured that goal later on to invent the first, his really great contribution was the use of the basic computer language, which was something I studied at the time. I knew it myself. He took the basic computer language and wrote an operating system for the first personal computer, the Altair. And this established Microsoft as the innovator in operating systems for the personal computer. A cost minimization firm is going to have a different kind of structure. A cost minimization firm is going to have a different structure. So I don't know if we talked, I don't think we talked about strategy before. No, I haven't taken attendance yet. I'll do it in a minute. So basically, the four major patterns of strategy, I should say, according to Michael Porter, who wrote a book, Competitive Strategy, in the 1980s, and it still has a big effect on how strategy is taught, is number one, cost minimization. Number two, differentiation, which is similar to innovation. Number three, focus, which can be either innovative, like you focus on a market segment and then innovate for that segment, or it can be cost, that you focus on a market segment and then you try to minimize cost for that segment. Focus is the most kind of ambiguous one, and there's often a lot of overlap between the other two, cost and differentiation and focus. But the basic idea is that for cost firms, you need more control. For differentiation firms, you need more flexibility. And the same is true for focus firms. So basically, if you're a cost minimization firm, whether it's focus or just pure cost, you need tight control, extensive work specialization, and high centralization. I think focus adds a little bit of difference. I think you probably need a little bit more stability, a little bit more long-term relationships with your employees if you have a cost focus firm. But basically, if you have an innovation firm or differentiation strategy, then you need to have an organic structure with that's looser, less formalized decentralization. If you borrow a term from a different typology, the Miles and Snow typology, who talked about I forget the terminology they use. One type would be the explorer or the innovator, and another type would be the defender, or the type that already has a product line and would try to minimize costs to defend the product line. Or there'd be firms that have no strategy, that are not thinking strategically, and then there would be firms that are analyzers or imitators. And these firms, analyzers, are firms that mix tight and loose properties of organizational behavior. So basically, analyzers copy other firms' innovations. Okay, so the four types: defenders, prospectors, analyzers, and reactors. Okay, and the defenders come up with the defenders defend their market share. The prospectors come up with new ideas. The analyzers imitate the prospectors, and reactors don't really have a strategy, and they react to the market conditions. And what they found was that the firms that are most successful are the analyzers. And so basically the type of organization, the firms that imitate the most innovative ones, but do a better job. For instance, Microsoft didn't invent Windows, but it copied Apple. And it was more successful at that time. Now Apple became more successful. And Apple in a way contradicts Miles and Snow because they're innovative and they've become highly successful. Although I don't think I have an Apple. I'm working on one right now. I don't think much of it. But in any case, one last point, then I'll take attendance. Size leads to specialization, more formalization, more bureaucracy, and more departmentalization. So organizational size is going to play a big role. Environmental factors also play a big role in affecting organizational structure. And national culture affects the preference for structure. Cultures with high power distance prefer mechanistic structures and centralization, while low power distance cultures prefer less structured organizations. Okay, next time we'll talk about organizational culture. I don't need to go into it now. So culture is a very important integrative tool, as I think I mentioned, and companies that have strong cultures tend to be more effective. Okay, that said, I will now take attendance and then you're free, class is over. So have a nice week and I will see you on Monday. I'll send the assignment around. And don't forget your fog of war discussion board is due tonight. So I will grade that later in the week. Okay, attendance, Farhad Abdul.
I'm here.
Hello.
Hello.
Ahmed Alkor.
I'm here.
Hello. Mohammed Afi. Afi, Mohammed. Jenna Bell. Jenna. Joseph Catanzaro.
I'm here, Professor.
Joseph. Jiamin Shen.
I'm here.
Hello. Janine Kola.
Here.
Hello. Kermia Cyrus.
I'm here.
Hello. David Esterowski.
I'm here.
Hello. Marimar Garcia.
Here.
Hello. Monica Garcia.
Here.
Hello.
Hello.
Alexia Harrigan.
Here.
Hello. Kani Jiang.
Here.
Hello. Yusuf Khan.
I'm here.
Hello. Georgie Karimishvili.
Here.
Georgie.
Here.
Hello. Summer.
Here.
Hello. Hangxian Lin.
Here.
Hello. Hamdi Mali.
I'm here, Professor.
Hello, Hamdi. Ludley Knoll.
I'm here.
Hi, Ludley. Famida Fatwari.
Hi, Professor. I'm here.
Hi, Famida. Emmanuel Plamakis. Emmanuel.
I
Raquel.
believe this person is stuck in the waiting room.
Oh yeah. Okay, let me check that. Oh, there are a couple of people I see. Raquel Porteous. Raquel.
Here, Professor. Hi,
Hello.
Professor. Here.
Hi, how you doing? Oh darn. Jishan Ruan. Jishan. Brendan.
Here, Professor.
Hi, Brendan. You asked a good question last time. I didn't get to it, but I saw it in the comments. Aaliyah Todd,
I'm here, here, Professor.
hello Aaliyah. Stacy Ergiles. Stacy. Denasia Warner. Denasia. Jack Wu.
Here, Professor.
Hello, Jack. Yayin Zhang.
I'm here, Professor.
Hello, Yichuan Zhang.
Here, Professor.
Hello, Matthew Zhao.
Here, Professor.
Hello, Taryn.
Here.
Hello, Taryn. Christian.
Good morning, Professor. I'm here.
Morning. Janaya.
Here.
Hello, Alexander.
Here.
Hello, Jack Shrem.
Good morning, Professor. Here.
Morning. Okay, I'm going to call off the people I didn't get the first time. If you're here, let me know. Mohammed Afi. This thing keeps jumping around. Mohammed Afi, Jenna Bell.
I'm here.
Okay, Jenna. Emmanuel Lamakis. And
Here. I'm here.
Emmanuel's here. Okay, good. And Stacy Ergiles. Stacy? Denasia Warner? Okay, so the people I haven't gotten, Mohammed Afi, Ruan Jishan. I'm sorry, Jishan Ruan. Jishan Ruan, Stacy Ergiles, Denasia Warner. Okay, any of those people here? Okay. All right. Okay, so I'll see you next time. And if you have questions, feel free to ask. I'll stay on for a minute. Anyone have any questions? We're 2 minutes over, but class is over. But if you have any questions, feel free to ask. Okay, see you next time.
Have a good day, Professor.
You too, Brendan. Take care. Thanks again for that question. I'm sorry I didn't get to it last time. I didn't see it until after it ended, so that's why I didn't get to it. But, by the way, feel free to interrupt me if you ever want to ask a question. Raise your hand or interrupt. It's fine.
Sure. All right. Thank you. Have a good one. Bye.
You too, Brendan. Take care.